Hi, I'm Jenny Thomas. I'm the director of Digital Health London, and I'm also the co-producer of FemTech TV. At Digital Health London, we help digital health startups to scale. We also support NHS staff to adopt digital innovations, and we do a lot of work in evidence generation for digital health. But my personal passion within digital health is FemTech. And I'm on a mission to kickstart a conversation around FemTech, talking to startups, healthcare staff, and corporates too. I really believe that healthier women lead to healthier families and healthier societies. And today I'm really excited to be interviewing Kate Brintworth, who is the Chief Midwife for the NHS in London. Thank you, Kate, so much for your time. I know you are an incredibly busy lady, so I really appreciate you joining me today, sharing all of your insights. And I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation based on the last 20 minutes. So thank you again. So perhaps we could just start with, if you could introduce yourself, say a little bit about your role as the Chief Midwife for London.
Thanks, Jenny. And thank you for asking to speak to me. So I'm a midwife by background. I've worked in all sorts of areas of the NHS, from community midwifery, helping women give birth at home, working on a busy labour ward, working in commissioning, working in regulation. And currently my role is encompassing the quality and safety of maternity services in London, of which digital obviously is an important stream within that.
Great, thank you so much. And of course, we met each other several years ago when we were part of the strategic maternity group for London. So can you tell us a bit about your current priorities? So you said to me earlier that the digital was, one part of many parts of your role. What has the last year been like for you, aside from extremely busy, when it's come to digital? What sort of things have you been involved in?
I think the past year has been really interesting for us in maternity, because I think it forced our hand into looking at how we deliver services in a way which doesn't come along very often, and in a way almost allowed us to test out some concepts which people have been talking about and been interested in and speculating on. And we actually got the opportunity to try it for real, if you like, from seeing women virtually to encouraging people to monitor themselves at home far more often, to, if you like, the infrastructure that surrounds the delivery of services, how that was organised and run. And I think it allowed innovation to flourish, because people were under pressure. They had problems to solve, such as having staff who weren't able to work on the front line, but who wanted to contribute, wanted to work, and so working with them virtually. So I think those were really, really interesting opportunities that we were able to do. I think we've learned a huge amount, not least listening to women about their experiences of what it's like to be on the receiving end of virtual care, which, is so far away from their usual experience, if you like, of what care might be like. You expect as a woman to go to see your midwife and sit in a room with her and have her take your blood pressure. So for that to be moved into a virtual space was a really, really challenging, I think, and interesting opportunity.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think back to the two times when I was pregnant and just imagining what that must have felt like. I think when there's a lot of anxiety regardless, and then there's a pandemic, so there's even more anxiety. Actually that I think, as I was saying earlier, like perhaps first time round being pregnant, I would have been a lot more unsure about the virtual support, and maybe you would have wanted or expected perhaps even to see my midwife. So I'm sure that there's been lots of kind of positive as well as negative experiences that people have had of this change. Have there been particular learnings in terms of the kind of positives and negatives?
I think one of the things which is common to lots of different services is concerns about safeguarding. We know that domestic violence increases during pregnancy anyway, and that is reliant on often the disclosure is reliant on the woman and midwife being able to have a conversation unoverheard, not overheard, not intruded on. And if you're having that conversation in a virtual space, you have no way of assuring the woman's safety in any of the things that she might tell you. So that I think proved to be challenging. I think for a lot of women, the virtual appointments were a good opportunity to stay away from the hospital. Pregnant women were quite fearful of attending services during the pandemic. They worried about contracting COVID, worried about the impact on themselves and their babies, quite understandably. So they welcomed virtual work. I think the other thing, it probably has highlighted the conversations around digital poverty. There is an assumption that, everyone has a smartphone these days. Well, you might have a smartphone. Can you charge it? Have you got data? Access to data, all of those things, access to Wi-Fi at the time you want it. Lots of assumptions go along with that are easy to make, but there are lots of people for whom that is not a reality. And also thinking about women who might not have English as a first language, you need interpreting services for them virtually can be easily facilitated now. We've got things that have actually improved. I think it's harder to do this kind of interaction for women who don't speak English as a first language. But if you are with the woman, there is now something called the interpreter on wheels, where you just dial into an interpreter who appears and functions in that space. And people who have had experience of that have talked about how much better that is than having an individual in the room.
Imagine that, actually.
You can turn the screen away, and they become very. If you want to examine the woman, you can easily turn the screen away. If you want, what they've described is that the interpreter, when they were in the room, was sometimes part of the conversation in a way that they didn't anticipate, whereas it becomes much more of a transaction with the interpreter doing the job of interpreting rather than contributing to the conversation and perhaps influencing the woman. So it's interesting reflection.
Yeah, I can see that as being a real advantage, actually, because I remember the logistics and kind of appointment times and,
impossible to manage.
Yeah, exactly. And actually the digital model probably being, I'm sure being much more financial sense, because you can, join another appointment immediately and be where you're needed. You don't have to kind of travel across, hospital sites, or even within one building could often be a challenge. So that's really interesting. But that's one of the I guess the positives, really.
Yeah. I think another positive has been, again, typically because of the role that I do, is looking at it from a more infrastructure perspective, is the pandemic and the use of Teams and Zoom has brought accessibility to the service user voice. So they've really been able to get in on the conversation and influence how services develop. And this has been a direction of care we've talked about for a long time, about how we manage, develop, correct our services, improve the quality of them. But we've never quite got over the sitting in rooms with a couple of women who might be able to turn up, who might not be able to, and it's not really a good time because it's school time and you only get 2 women there. We now have all the maternity voice partnership chairs, which is a service user group that each maternity service has. They all meet regularly in London on Zoom, and they all turn up and they share their experiences. They invite me along and tell me what I need to be doing, which is brilliant. That level of accessibility for them to people like myself, and equally for people like myself, that level of accessibility to people like them has just been phenomenal, and opened up lots of conversations. And it's really, for me, I think this is one of the bright spots around digital working, is that the putting the woman first, be it in her own care or be it in creating the infrastructure around care, how care is delivered, has really been accelerated.
Yeah, no, I would I hadn't thought about that, and I certainly remember, being in our monthly user group meeting when I was a general manager of women's services, and yeah, it's really hard, isn't it, to organise at a time and in a way where you can get really great representation. And I think, as you were saying, because of some of the challenges around digital inclusion, it's more important than ever to get those different voices and to really hear from women who, you know, it might be quite difficult to attend, and for all sorts of different reasons. There's a lot of barriers. So I think that's that's a brilliant, it's not direct care, but it's a brilliant thing that's come out of this awful situation, that in the long run there should be lot more voices. And I guess also there's lots of different ways. It's about kind of those video meetings, but using digital to kind of get more instant feedback from women in different ways in terms of what it's like on a ward, or you know, I don't know, even something's run out, you know, that they need. There's lots of different kind of things to think about in that regard too, I can imagine. So real time as well as after the event, which will help other women. Yeah.
And seeking, sorry.
Go for it.
I was going to say, and seeking help, you know, we've had innovations like Ask Edie have been around for quite a long time. So that's something that Lewisham and Greenwich hospitals run, where they have a virtual midwife and women can email her and ask for advice and support for non-urgent problems. We've seen a rise in helplines, which have been really well used. And also things like antenatal education. Suddenly all the group work that we used to do, that all had to go online very, very quickly. And again, you've increased the accessibility, because if you put those things online, women can dip into them when it suits them, rather than they've got to take time off work because it's only run on a Thursday at 3 o'clock. You know, all of that is swept away, and suddenly you put the woman in control of her own experience around being able to access information. And I think it's also accelerated our conversations around, well, websites aren't good enough in maternity services. You know, they don't have the right information, or if they do have the right information, is it translated easily, you know, rather than relying on Google Translate, which might get it back to front, you know, and also gives the opportunity for much more video work for women who don't have a written language, you know. So there's loads of opportunities here to reach out to individual women and put them in control of how they build their experience in maternity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's fascinating. And what about some of the challenges? So undoubtedly, I mean, there's always been challenges in terms of kind of, you know, pulling on the opportunity of digital, but what has been some of the learning you've had around things not to do, or things that could be done, but they need to be iterated in order for them to be like really effective?
I think some of the challenges, women talked about not finding the virtual experience satisfying at times. They wanted that personal interaction. They wanted to be in a room with another human being talking to them. And, you know, we were talking earlier about how we have, all of us, become much more fluent and savvy at this type of virtual working. But it's taken quite a while, actually. And I think there's probably a skill set here that needs to be developed that we have forgotten. I think it's very easy to say, oh, wouldn't it be great? You know, you can both be talking to each other, and, you know, you'll be in a camera and no one has to travel, and you immediately rush to the advantages, but without thinking about you're still two humans having an interaction, and that might need managing in a different way. You know, there are particular things that we rely on as human around cues and functioning and listening, and you're having to develop that skill set in a slightly different way to the way you would if someone was sat in front of you. So I think that's something that we probably need to spend a little bit more time thinking about.
Absolutely. And you mentioned before about some of the quite basic sort of infrastructure challenges that really need to be.
Oh, they're huge. Yeah. I think, you know, particularly the younger generation of midwives, they are absolutely unfazed by the idea of digital working, embrace it, see it as normal, rational, reasonable, the way to go. But unfortunately, the infrastructure around hospitals is often a little bit behind. it's a very intangible investment in some ways. It's not concrete, like saying we've built a new ward and we're going to have, 20 more orthopedic surgeries every day. Than something as seemingly mundane that we all take for granted as Wi-Fi, which lots of hospitals, they haven't sorted out their Wi-Fi, it's intermittent, or they have very overly developed firewalls which stop programs functioning properly. There might be umpteen logins to get into something. So by the time you actually get to the thing that you've done, you've spent 10 minutes to get to the point where you might be actually involved in the care of, documenting the care of the patient, for example, or being able to give a drug. First you've got to spend 10 minutes finding the computer, finding the keys for the drug cupboard. Then you've got to go through the firewall, and so on. And I think we haven't at times given enough thought to the really nitty gritty, sweat the small stuff. Commander Chris Hadfield, who was the astronaut who went into space a couple of years ago, he wrote a book about his experiences, and the thing he said is we always sweat the small stuff because actually it's important for safety. If we didn't sweat the small stuff, then this whole program would fall apart, and I think we have something to learn there. We're so busy painting broad pictures and being excited about the concepts that we're forgetting what it's like to be that nurse or that midwife or that care assistant or that doctor using that technology in a very, very seemingly mundane way. I think we need to pay more attention to that, because actually when you talk to people about digital, what everyone says is it's all about the people.
Yeah, absolutely. And getting those basics right, is so important, because without it you don't have the either ability to kind of think through what the options are, or when something is put in place, it just doesn't work as well. And it was interesting what you said about some of the challenges. It sounds like there's also a real need to invest in digital literacy kind of education, that's something that would, as well as sort of the tech itself, actually it's a human skill, isn't it? How you interact with technology, and different people,
I think there's also
different levels of competence.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we are seeing that as well, for some people who are older, like myself. I'm 51. I didn't grow up with a mobile phone in my hand, ostensibly a computer in my hand. I remember them, the first versions of them. I'm old enough to remember that. It can seem a little bit distant and a little bit, it's just, a toy. It's almost like it's a toy. It's not real. It's not quite something to be taken seriously. It's all a little bit icing on the cake-ish, rather than recognizing that there are really quite serious issues here about how we interact with the people we care for, how we bring them into their own care. And so I've heard sometimes younger midwives who've grown up with technology and feel very confident and very fluent with it, saying the people who are in senior positions who are older and haven't grown up with it don't feel so fluent. So their strategy, their confidence and their vision is not what they are expecting to see. So I think when we talk about digital literacy, there's something about the senior leadership being brought into that space, and we need to learn from our juniors. We need to be humble and perhaps say, right, okay, my assumptions on this really need to have another look.
Absolutely. And do you have any plans around that in your role? I know that Health Education England are doing lots of work in that space, and at Digital Health London we run the Pioneer Fellowship and support staff across London. But are there kind of, I was just thinking about the digital midwife role, which I know you've had in your organisation, I had in mine, but it's not necessarily a role that's been in every organisation, which is sort of one part of, I guess, having that responsibility assigned to a member of staff. But I guess that's a bit different to having the leadership piece that you just set out.
I think those digital midwife roles can be really interesting because they can be a real catalyst for change. If you get the right people in them, they can stimulate conversation and they can get that learning going. I guess it's also about how those roles are constructed. So, you know, a digital midwife role can be anything from showing people how to log on to the system that you have decided to adopt, to data cleaning, to having the vision to say, how are we going to work digitally as an organisation? And there is very little definition around that, and you know, a lot, and therefore a lot of variety. I mean, an interesting example recently is there's something called the Maternity Services Data Set, which is a national data set collecting data from every organisation, maternity service in England. And there are standards being set, and we're trying to get all organisations to contribute, and it's a mammoth task. And one of the interesting reflections we found is again, that human element was missing in some organisations, where they didn't recognise the journey of the data from the person inputting it through the system to it coming out the other end, to then it leaving the organisation, being submitted to the MSDS. And all the different people involved, none of whom were joined up sometimes. So you just had people doing their bit. I do the front end, I do the middle bit, I do the end, without understanding that actually there is an arc that needs to be considered about, and someone needs to have that strategic overview. So yeah, lots of reflections on how, again, you need to think about the human element, but that strategic overview is so often missing in services.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think that I know there's also a big review at the moment on data and how different organisations access data. And actually, if there's not kind of a process in place, you don't kind of think about it kind of from end to end, the kind of operational reality of like, I know if someone needs data, like how do you make a request? You've got a process in place for FOIs, for example, but not about data, which actually could be really useful in terms of kind of thinking about, you know, things on a population level. So just to jump back a bit, you started to talk about digital inclusion and some of the learning that was coming out of that. Have you seen any good examples of organisations in London or perhaps further afield, the NHS, where they have been able to address issues, you know, relating to whether that's kind of devices or data or other things that, you know, are working?
I think one example that came out of the pandemic as a way of working was heads of service, heads of midwifery, directors of midwifery making themselves available online to their local population for questions and insights. So, you know, as part of the care package, it's ask the head of midwifery, you know, what do you want to know? We're available. And used in community groups to make contacts with community groups, so that those who might traditionally feel a little bit reserved and a bit less likely, not all communities feel confident and want to come forward and ask questions, encouraging them to come in. I think that's been a really exciting and good opportunity. There is something called the Mother and Baby app, which has been developed in Northwest London, which has encourages the woman to input into her own care, and the caregivers work together with the woman on what she's putting in. So they're creating a record of her pregnancy together. It's an opportunity to ask questions. There are apps like the Baby Body app, which have Yeah, it's great, isn't it? And it has all these videos in that they have spent a lot of time thinking about, so they're really accessible. So very, you know, lots of nice little bits of information that you can pick up, digest, watch it again and again.
And actually, so there's lots of ways. In time is so helpful. I remember, because every week, almost day in your pregnancy, you're in a different place. And I learned, I thought I knew quite a lot about pregnancy, having worked in women's health before I became pregnant, but I didn't appreciate that journey in terms of like, okay, so it's not strange that you know, whatever, week 14, I've got like strange pains. It wasn't something I was really aware of, but having that app helped me to kind of learn, actually, well, these might be some of the things. They might not necessarily be experiencing this, but there are things to look out for, and you know, what's normal and what's not.
Yeah,
it's really useful. Okay, what would also be interesting is we talked before we started recording this about some of the, you know, the significant challenges around kind of getting digital, particularly some of the kind of basics on infrastructure. If those things were kind of resolved and taken away, it would be so fascinating to hear from you about, well, what are the, if we, you know, there's a lot of talk about reimagining care pathways. That's the kind of, particularly the NHS X language. What do you think would be great to see from, I mean, we might be talking kind of 5 years time, 10 years time, but where do you feel that there is a potential to kind of really reimagine a pathway in the, I guess, because women have, although you could say that is their maternity pathway, it's, you know, 9 months plus 3, but actually there are different pathways within, you know, for different women who have different conditions and things. Do you have a sense of what you love to see in the future, kind of what the opportunity could be if those other things came into line?
I think the opportunities are definitely around the ability to have multidisciplinary team working around more around the world. So very typically, you know, if a woman has a problem, she might go and see the endocrinologist if she is diabetic, and then she may go and see the obstetrician. And we have been moving towards trying to have joint clinics with midwife, endocrinologist, or obstetrician. And I think digital offers an opportunity for that to just be much more fluent and easily accessible, and less of something where people are having to work very hard to coordinate getting all those people in a room together. I think the accessibility, as I've already talked about, to information, to help and support. Pregnant women have a lot of questions a lot of the time.
Oh yeah, I did.
Yeah, exactly. And when, you know, when you think about something like Ask Edie, or even, you know, just a maternity helpline that you ring up, they are bombarded with calls with women have questions. And there's something there, isn't there, about women needing to access information at all different times, which may not be when their midwife is working, or they, you know, they're given a clinic number to ring and nobody answers it, or it takes a long time to be answered. But that connectivity feels like it be improved. My hope is that currently, I think we haven't got the balance right, and I hope that the balance will shift to the technology being an adjunct to the midwife-woman relationship, rather than the moment where it feels a little bit like people are talking around midwife means with woman, and at the moment people are saying it's with computer. You know, I feel like I'm with the computer. I have to, if I'm going to see that woman, I have to log on to the system. I have to write a very long summary of what's going on, what my plan of care is, that takes 10-15 minutes, and I've not even said hello to the woman. And then I need to give her some medication, for example, on the postnatal ward, and again that takes another 5-10 minutes to find the keys for the drug cupboard, plus to find a computer that's free so I can log on to it, go through all the systems I have to find the woman and find the drug and then fill it in. So, and then when I've given it to her, I have to go back and say I've administered it. So, you know, my hope, my vision would be that we get some more fluency around it. We can get the security right, which obviously we need all of this to be really secure, but we get the security right so that the midwife takes it with her, so it becomes, as I say, an adjunct to that conversation, something that they can share between them, rather than something that the midwife has to go off and do the computer and then come back and actually deliver care. So at the moment we've got this bifurcation of computer and care, and we haven't got it like that where those two things are intertwined.
Oh, absolutely. And do you think there's anything around remote monitoring? So in addition to kind of the virtual consultations, are there any opportunities in that?
Absolutely. I mean, we've been seeing this, haven't we, with diabetes care and hypertension. And I think that's a really, really important way forward, because, you know, when I'm also a nurse, qualified as a nurse years ago, and you were put in the position of the expert, whereas actually as a nurse, when you met someone who had a condition for a very long time, the first thing you did was you shut your mouth and opened your ears, because that person was the expert on their own condition. And actually it's the woman that's pregnant, it's the woman that's experienced everything. We need to close our mouths a bit and listen a bit more. And by engaging women in remote monitoring, as I've said in those two simple examples, there's a real opportunity to support women remaining the experts in their own care, because they know what they need for themselves, their baby and their family.
Yeah, fascinating. So just in our last few minutes, what is next kind of for you in your role, and what do you want to kind of focus on in the near term in respect to the digital? Is it about kind of getting the basics right and the sort of I guess infrastructure and the education piece, or are there particular areas of innovation that you would like to focus on more?
I think the two things that are probably, because the infrastructure piece sits more generally rather than maternity per se. So I think, yes, I would like that to improve. And I think we need to be getting our leaders to recognise that they need to be banging on the door of their CIOs in their organisations and saying, stop just leaving maternity over there, and recognise we are part of your system and you're part of our system. We all need to work together. And so that would be the first thing, I think, that we, particularly having just gone through what we did in relation to submission to the maternity services data set and the difficulties and what we learned so much about how organisations function and about how the different parts of the system are interplaying. So I think there is some stuff there that we need to pick up and support. And the other bit is about bringing women, as I've already said over and again, bringing women into the centre of their care. And I think particularly one of our focuses is on women who may find that more challenging. So particularly around language, I'm really interested that we pick up, and language support has lots of different formats, and people are just tending to work with what they've got. And again, it comes back to that banging on the door to say, no, what we need, we are a 24-hour emergency service, so we need to have this kind of video dialing in for languages. We need it. It's an absolute fundamental, rather than, oh, it would be nice if we could get hold of someone on the phone who spoke the language. We need to be changing the dialogue from it would be nice to have to recognising that this is a really important contribution to safety. So I think those are probably getting the system worked up and getting women pulled into their own care and supported in the safest way possible.
Great, thank you so much. One of the things I could just hear my 1-year-old in the background there. When I was pregnant with her, I thought a lot about when if she decides to have a family, what her maternity experience is going to be like, and what will be different, and what will be the same, and what I would like to be different. And I think it's that for me, it was about the information and knowing more about what was going on in my body. Should I be worried that I was bleeding? Knowing at the beginning, before I was even pregnant, actually that's likely to happen because your mum had that, or whatever I don't even know if that's like a genetic kind of thing, or there's so much that we could know, and that would take the pressure off those that are looking after us as well, and that we could help by having access to that. So I'm really interested in what that would look like for her.
Absolutely.
But thank you so much for your time. I know you are, as I said at the beginning, such a busy lady, and actually on annual leave this week, so you've got extra well there. So thank you so much. I'm sure that
Pleasure.
anyone listening found it absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks very much.